Every day, people around the world make ethical decisions regarding public speech. Is it ever appropriate to lie to a group of people if it's in the group's best interest? As a speaker, should you use evidence within a speech that you're not sure is correct if it supports the speech's core argument? As a listener, should you refuse to listen to a speaker with whom you fundamentally disagree? These are examples that represent ethical choices speakers and listeners face in the public speaking context. In this video, I will explore what it means to be both an ethical speaker and an ethical listener. The word ethics can mean many different things to different people. Whether it is an ethical lapse in business or politics or a disagreement about medical treatments and end-of-life choices, people come into contact with ethical dilemmas regularly. Speakers and listeners of public speech face numerous ethical dilemmas as well. What kinds of support materials and sources are ethical to use? How much should a speaker adapt to an audience without sacrificing his or her own views? And what makes a speech ethical? Today we will look at the ethics pyramid. It involves three basic concepts: intent, means, and ends. The first major consideration to be aware of when examining the ethicality of something is the issue of intent. To be an ethical speaker or listener, it is important to begin with ethical intentions. For example, if we agree that honesty is ethical, it follows that ethical speakers will prepare their remarks with the intention of telling the truth to their audiences. Similarly, if we agree that it is ethical to listen with an open mind, it follows that ethical listeners will be intentional about letting a speaker make his or her case before forming judgments. In this cartoon, Calvin has a hard time understanding ethics. After intent comes means. Now, when I say means as the second level of the ethics pyramid, I'm talking about the tools or behaviors we employ to achieve a desired outcome. We must realize that there are a range of possible behavioral choices for any situation, and that some choices are good, some are bad, and some fall in between. For example, suppose you want your friend Aisha to spend an hour reviewing a draft for your speech according to criteria such as audience appropriateness, adequate research, and dynamic introduction and conclusion. What means might you use to persuade her to do you this favor? You might explain that you value her opinion and will gladly return the favor the next time she's preparing the speech. That's a good means. Or you might threaten to tell a professor that Aisha cheated on a test. That's a bad means. While both of these means may lead to the same end, having Aisha agree to review your speech, one is clearly more ethical than the other. The final part of the ethics pyramid is the ends. According to researchers, ends are those outcomes that you desire to achieve. Examples of ends might include persuading your audience to make a financial contribution for your participation in Relay for Life, persuading a group of homeowners that your real estate agency would best meet their needs, or informing your fellow students about newly required college fees. Whereas the means are the behavioral choices we make, the ends are the results of those choices. Like intentions and means, ends can be good or bad, or they can fall into a gray area where it is unclear just how ethical or unethical they are. For example, suppose the City Council wants to balance the city's annual budget. Balancing the budget may be a good end, assuming that the city has adequate tax revenues and areas of discretionary spending. However, voters might argue that balancing the budget is a bad end if the city lacks these things for the year in question, because in that case, balancing the budget would require raising taxes, curtailing essential city services, or both. When examining ends, we need to think about both the source and the receiver of the message or the behavior. Some end results could be a good for the source, but bad for the receiver, or vice versa. Suppose, for example, that Anita belongs to a club that's raffling off a course of dancing lessons. Anita sells Ben a $10 raffle ticket. However, Ben later thinks it over and realizes he has no desire to take dancing lessons, and that even if he should win the raffle, he will never take the lessons. Anita's club has gained $10, a good end, but Ben has lost $10, a bad end. Again, the ethical standards you and your audience expect to meet will help in deciding whether a particular combination of speaker and audience ends is ethical. Ultimately, understanding ethics is a matter of balancing all three parts of the ethical pyramid: intent, means, and ends. As public speakers, one of the first ethical areas we should be concerned with is information honesty. While there are cases where speakers have blatantly lied to an audience, it's more common for speakers to prove a point by exaggerating, omitting facts that weigh against their message, or distorting information. I believe that speakers build a relationship with their audiences, and that lying, exaggerating, or distorting information violates this relationship. Ultimately, a speaker will be more persuasive by using reason and logical arguments supported by facts rather than relying on emotional appeals designed to manipulate an audience. Speakers tend to fall into one of two major traps with plagiarism. The first trap is failing to tell the audience the source of a direct quotation. To avoid plagiarism, you always need to tell your audience when you are directly quoting information within a speech. The second plagiarism trap public speakers fall into is paraphrasing what someone else said or wrote without giving credit to the speaker or author. For example, you may have read a book and learned that there are 3 types of schoolyard bullying. In the middle of your speech, you may have talked about these 3 types of bullying. If you don't tell your audience where you found that information, you're plagiarizing. Typically, the only information you don't need to cite is information that is general knowledge. General knowledge is information that is publicly available and widely known by a large segment of society. For example, you don't need to provide a citation for a speech for the name of, say, Oklahoma's capital. Another ethical principle you must consider is that a civil society depends on freedom of expression, a diversity of perspective, and tolerance of dissent, and that informed and responsible decisions can only be made if all members of society are free to express their thoughts and opinions. Further, it holds that diverse viewpoints, including those that disagree with accepted authority, are important for the functioning of a democratic society. If everyone only listened to one source of information, then we would be easily manipulated and controlled. For this reason, I believe that individuals should be willing to listen to a range of speakers on a given subject. As listeners or consumers of communication, we should realize that this diversity of perspective enables us to be more fully informed on a subject. Imagine voting in an election after listening to only the campaign speeches of one candidate. The perspective of that candidate would be so narrow that you would have no way to accurately understand and assess the issues at hand or the strengths and weaknesses of the opposing candidates. Unfortunately, some voters do limit themselves to listening only to their candidate of choice and, as a result, base their voting decisions on incomplete and, not infrequently, inaccurate information. Listening to diverse perspectives includes being willing to hear dissenting voices. Dissent is by nature uncomfortable, as it entails expressing opposition to authority, often in very unflattering terms. Legal scholars have argued in favor of some symbolic speech, such as flag burning, because we as a society value the ability of anyone to express their dissent against the will and ideas of the majority. Ethical communicators will be receptive to dissent, no matter how strongly they may disagree with the speaker's message, because they realize that a society that forbids dissent cannot function democratically. Ultimately, honoring free speech and seeking out a variety of perspective is important for all listeners. Speakers need to take a two-pronged approach when addressing any audience: caring about the audience and understanding the audience. When you as a speaker truly care about your audience's needs and desires, you avoid setting up a manipulative climate. That is not to say that your audience will always perceive their own needs and desires in the same way you do, but if you make an honest effort to speak to your audience in a way that has their best interests at heart, you are more likely to create a persuasive argument that is not just a manipulative appeal. Second, it is important for you as the speaker to create an atmosphere of mutual understanding. To do this, you should first learn as much as possible about your audience, a process I call audience analysis. I'll first discuss this topic in more detail in the audience analysis part of a video. To create a climate of caring and mutual respect, it is important for us as speakers to be open with our audience so that our intentions and perceptions are clear, Nothing alienates an audience faster than a speaker with a hidden agenda, unrelated to the stated purpose of the speech. One researcher once listened to a speaker give a 2-hour talk, allegedly about workplace wellness, which actually turned out to be an infomercial for the speaker's weight loss program. Imagine that. In this case, the speaker clearly had a hidden, or even not so hidden agenda, which made the audience feel disrespected. Finding the truth. This ethical principle is very important for all speakers. Hopefully, intimidation, coercion, and violence will not be part of your public speaking experience, but some public speakers have been known to call for violence and incite mobs of people to commit atrocities. Thus, distortion and expressions of intolerance and hatred are of special concerns when it comes to public speaking. Distortion occurs when someone purposely twists information in a way that detracts from its original meaning. Unfortunately, some speakers take information and use it in a manner that is not in the spirit of the original information. One place we see distortion frequently is in the political context, where politicians cite a statistic or the results of a study and either completely alter the information or use it in a deceptive manner. FactCheck.org and PolitiFact are nonpartisan organizations devoted to analyzing political messages and demonstrating how information has been distorted. Expressions of intolerance and hatred that are to be avoided include using ageist, heterosexist, racist, sexist, and any other form of speech that demeans or belittles a group of people. Hate speech from all sides of the political spectrum in our society is detrimental to ethical communication. If it's an ism, it should be avoided. At the same time, it is important for listeners to pay attention to expressions of intolerance or hatred. Extremist speakers sometimes attempt to disguise their true agendas by avoiding bigoted buzzwords and using mild-sounding terms instead. Sometimes we call these dog whistles. For example, a speaker advocating the overthrow of a government might use the term regime change instead of revolution. Similarly, proponents of genocide in various parts of the world have used the term ethnic cleansing instead of extermination. By listening critically to the gist of a speaker's message, as well as specific language he or she uses, we can see how that speaker views the world. I believe that finding and bringing light to situations of inequality and injustice within our society is important. Public speaking has been used throughout history to point out equality and injustice. From Patrick Henry arguing against the way the English government treated the American colonists, and Sojourner Truth describing the evils of slavery, to Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech, and Army Lieutenant Dan Choi's speeches arguing that the military's don't ask, don't tell policy is unjust. Many social justice movements have started because young public speakers have decided to stand up for what they believe is fair and just. We live in a society where a speaker's message can literally be heard around the world in a matter of minutes. Thanks to our global communication networks, extreme remarks made by politicians, media commentators, and celebrities, as well as ordinary people, can unexpectedly go viral with regrettable consequences. It is not unusual to see situations where a speaker talks hatefully about a specific group, but when one of the speaker's listeners violently attacks a member of the group, the speaker may insist that he or she had no way of knowing that this could possibly have happened. Washing one's hands of responsibility is unacceptable. All speakers should accept responsibility for the short-term and long-term consequences of their speeches. Although it is certainly not always the speaker's fault if someone commits an act of violence, the speaker should take responsibility for his or her role in the situation. This process involves being truly reflective and willing to examine how one's speech could have tragic consequences. Free speech is especially important to us as public speakers because expressing information and ideas is the purpose of public speaking. It is also important to audiences of public speeches because free speech allows us to hear and consider multiple points of view so we can make more informed decisions. Free speech was so important to the founders of the United States that it was included in the first of the 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution that are known as our Bill of Rights. Free speech does not mean, however, that every U.S. citizen has the legal right to say anything at any time. If your speech is likely to lead to violence or other illegal acts, it is not protected. One recent example is a 2007 Supreme Court decision in the Morse et al. Versus Frederick case. In this case, a high school student held up a sign reading "Bong hits for Jesus" across from the school during a 2002 Olympic torch relay. The principal suspended the teenager, and the teen sued the principal for violating his First Amendment rights. Ultimately, the court decided the principal did have the right to suspend the student because he was advocating illegal behavior while at a school event. The meaning of free speech is constantly being debated by politicians, judges, and the public, even within the United States, where this right has been discussed for over 200 years. As U.S. citizens, it is important to be aware of both the protections afforded by free speech and the limits so that we can be both articulate speakers and critical listeners when issues such as anti-war protests at military funerals or speech advocating violence against members of specific groups come up within our communities. Ethical speaking is the responsibility of all of us.